That refreshing glass of water in the morning. Ever stop to think where it truly comes from? Today, we're diving deep into a region where that simple act is facing, well, enormous challenges. Rural peninsular India.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it? How something so basic like your morning water connects directly to massive farming operations, maybe thousands of miles away.
It really does highlight this intricate web. So we're going to be guided by a really compelling news study just out this April in PLOS Water.
Okay.
It's titled Chasing the Water Table: The Impact of Groundwater Depletion on Rural Drinking Water Supply in Peninsular India.
Right. Chasing the water table. That title says a lot already.
It does, and it zooms right in on two specific local administrative areas. They're called Gram Panchayats, Aralumallige, and Dadathumakuru. These are both in the Upper Arkavathy watershed near Bengaluru.
So this isn't just some high-level overview. It's very much boots-on-the-ground research in a specific place.
Exactly. And our mission today, really, is to unpack what's going on. How bad is the groundwater situation? What's causing it? And crucially, what's the actual financial hit these communities are taking just trying to get clean drinking water?
Because that's something we often just take for granted, isn't it? Turning on the tap.
Absolutely. And while the study focuses on these villages, the lessons learned, well, they could echo far beyond this one region.
Okay, sounds like a critical issue. Where should we start? Maybe with the scale of the problem. Just how much does rural India depend on this groundwater?
Yeah, the numbers are pretty stark. Get this. Over 85% of rural drinking water in India comes from borewells, groundwater wells.
85%. Wow.
And here's the kicker. India's own Central Groundwater Board classifies over a third of the country's groundwater as semi-critical, critical, or even overexploited.
So we're talking about a system already flashing some serious warning signs?
Definitely under stress. And the study points out something important. Before this research, we actually lacked hard quantitative evidence on just how risky this depletion is for the long-term sustainability of these water sources. We knew it was bad, but not precisely how bad for drinking water supply.
Right, we had the general picture, but not the sharp details on the actual risk to people's taps.
And it seems like the way groundwater has been monitored in this part of India, well, it might not be giving us the full story. Why is that?
It really comes down to the geology. Peninsular India mostly sits on what's called hard rock aquifers. Imagine solid rock, but it's got cracks and fractures, especially near the surface, where water collects.
Okay, like a kind of rocky sponge near the top?
Sort of, yeah. But deeper down, those water-holding cracks become fewer and smaller. Historically, people used shallow wells to tap that upper sponge. But intense pumping means that the zone is now largely dewatered in many areas, including the study site.
Ah, so the easy-to-reach water is gone.
Pretty much. And then there's this issue called survivor bias in the data.
Survivor bias.
Yeah, when monitoring wells run dry, they often just get dropped from the monitoring network. So the data we see tends to only reflect the wells that are still working, the survivors. It can paint a misleadingly optimistic picture.
Right, because you're not counting all the ones that failed. Okay, so the study focuses on this specific area, the Aralumallige Subwatershed. What's it like there?
It's a pretty dry place, semi-arid. It only gets about 800 millimeters of rain a year, which isn't a lot.
Okay.
And here's the thing. The amount of water that could potentially evaporate is more than double the rainfall, so water is scarce. And crucially, groundwater is the only source for irrigation there. That's key.
The only source for farmers.
Got it. And these hard rock aquifers, how have they held up?
Well, like I said, that shallow, more fractured zone got hit hard. The study suggests it was pretty much depleted by the 1990s because of all the pumping for irrigation.
So people had to start drilling much deeper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to how this study was done. It sounds like they were incredibly thorough. They really were. It wasn't just sampling. They did a full census, a 100% count of all the wells in the subwatershed.
All of them, private farm wells and the public drinking water wells.
Yep, both. They geotagged every single one, recorded when it was built, how deep it went, and importantly, if it failed, when that happened. A massive undertaking to get that complete picture.
That's impressive detail. So what did this well census uncover about how long these wells actually last? You mentioned it was concerning.
It really is. Almost 55%, more than half of all the wells ever drilled in that area have failed, gone dry.
Wow.
But here's the really alarming statistic for drinking water.
Yeah.
70% of the Gram Panchayat drinking water wells failed within just 10 years of being drilled.
10 years?
Yeah.
That's incredibly short for vital infrastructure.
It is. And the main reason, just the water table dropping too fast. It wasn't well failure in terms of mechanics. It was the source disappearing.
So it's not like the pump broke down necessarily. The water just wasn't there to pump anymore.
Precisely. And they checked, was it maybe water quality issues forcing abandonment, like high fluoride or nitrates?
That can be a problem in some areas.
It can, but according to the local Gram Panchayat officials, that wasn't the main driver here. Out of 79 abandoned drinking water wells they looked at, only 2 were reportedly shut down due to high fluoride. Nitrate levels were sometimes high, but failure was overwhelmingly about the quantity, not the quality.
Okay, so the water just vanished. It really is a case of literally chasing the water table deeper.
Exactly. And the study has figures 2 and 3, that show this visually. You see the average depth of both private irrigation wells and the public drinking water wells just going down, down, down over time.
Like a race to the bottom almost.
Pretty much. Initially, the private farm wells were deeper, maybe because farmers hit the limits first. But after around 2000, the Gram Panchayats also had to start drilling much, much deeper wells just to keep supplying drinking water.
Yeah.
It's a clear trend.
Okay, the severity is clear. Wells failing fast, everyone drilling deeper. Let's dig into the why. What's the main culprit draining all this groundwater?
The study points the finger squarely at agricultural water use, irrigation.
Right. How did they figure that out? Measuring water use across a whole area seems complicated.
It is, but they used a pretty standard method, the FAO methodology, combined with some clever tech. They analyzed satellite images using Google Earth Engine, looking at land use changes going way back from 1993 to 2021.
Ah, so they could see what crops were being grown where and when.
Exactly. That, combined with info on cropping patterns and the types of irrigation being used, allowed them to estimate how much water agriculture was consuming over the years.
And irrigation techniques have changed there, right? I thought I read something about more efficient methods being adopted.
They have. It's quite a shift. Before 1991, it was basically all flood irrigation, just flooding the fields.
Yeah.
Very water intensive.
Yeah, it uses a ton of water.
But by 2021, they estimate that 90% of irrigation was using drip systems. Much more targeted, water goes right to the roots. So definitely more efficient on paper.
So farmers adopted better tech, which is good, but the groundwater levels still kept dropping.
That's the paradox. Even with more efficient drip irrigation, the sheer amount of water being pulled out was too much. Figure 4 in the study really lays this bare.
What does it show?
It compares the estimated irrigation water withdrawals to domestic water use, for drinking and household needs, and also to the estimated natural groundwater recharge from rain.
And the comparison is
Stark. Irrigation withdrawals are somewhere between 10 and 20 times higher than domestic withdrawals.
10 to 20 times.
Yeah. And the total amount being withdrawn, even with efficient drip irrigation, is still way more than the amount of water naturally going back into the ground. The system is just fundamentally out of balance.
So efficiency gains were basically swamped by the scale of the withdrawal.
Exactly. And despite all these wells failing, remember that 55% failure rate. The amount of land being irrigated actually went up.
Wait, really? How much?
Table 3 shows it grew significantly. By 2021, irrigated land covered about 40% of the entire subwatershed. So, more wells failing, but also more land being farmed using the remaining deeper wells.
That sounds completely unsustainable. More demand on an already dwindling resource.
It really paints that picture. And the study connects this expansion, in part, to government policy. Specifically, free electricity for farmers to pump irrigation water.
Ah, the free power scheme. That started quite a while ago, didn't it?
Yeah, back in the early 1980s. The idea was to help farmers, obviously. But the unintended consequence was that it removed a major cost factor for pumping groundwater.
Making it much cheaper to just drill a well and pump as much as you needed.
Right. So this study links that policy directly to the explosion in private bore wells and the subsequent overdraft, the overextraction, of groundwater that led to the current crisis. It's a classic example of how well-intentioned policy can have serious downstream effects.
Okay, so water's vanishing, driven mainly by agriculture, which is partly fueled by policy. Let's talk about the money side. What's the financial burden this is putting on the local Gram Panchayats, the ones responsible for drinking water?
This is where it gets really, really tough for these local bodies. The study quantifies this strain, and it's alarming. They talk about duplicate investment.
Duplicate investment, meaning?
Meaning they keep having to spend money just to stand still. Between 2011 and 2021, they drilled 41 new drinking water wells. But guess how many of those failed in that same period?
Uh-oh. Given the earlier numbers, quite a few.
30. 30 out of 41 failed within that decade. So they had to keep drilling new wells just to replace the ones that were going dry almost immediately.
They're basically throwing money into holes that dry up. That sounds incredibly expensive.
It is. The estimated cost just to drill those 30 replacement wells was nearly US $200,000. And the original cost of the wells that failed, even adjusted for inflation, was another US $183,000 or so.
That's a huge amount of money for local village councils, spent just to maintain the status quo, not even improve things.
Exactly. And that's just the cost of drilling. What about the cost of actually pumping the water from these ever deeper wells?
Right. Deeper wells mean more energy needed to lift the water.
A lot more energy. Remember how the average well depth increased dramatically? From about 183 meters to 321 meters.
Yeah.
According to the Gram Panchayat staff interviewed for the study, their electricity bills for pumping drinking water tripled in just the last decade because of that.
Tripled. Just the electricity cost.
Just the electricity. That's a massive operational cost increase.
How does that compare to their overall budget? Can they even afford that?
This is the most shocking finding, I think. The study found that the money these two Gram Panchayats are spending just on electricity to pump drinking water now exceeds their total revenue.
Exceeds everything. Taxes, government grants, all of it.
Yes. Combined. They're spending more pumping water than they bring in overall.
That's not just unsustainable. That's a financial crisis right there.
It is. They are deep in debt just to provide water. Table 6 shows they've built up significant electricity debt over almost 10 years. And of course, that debt is accumulating interest.
So they're trapped.
Seems like it. And while there are government programs, like Jal Jeevan Mission, which help pay for drilling the initial well.
A capital cost.
Right. But they don't cover these ballooning operational costs, the pumping costs. So the Gram Panchayats are left holding this massive growing electricity bill, which seriously threatens future access to piped water for everyone in those villages. Imagine your town spending more on streetlights than it collects in taxes. It just doesn't work.
It really sounds like they're caught between a rock and a hard place, or maybe between a dry well and a massive electricity bill. What options are even on the table? What does the study suggest?
Well, it acknowledges the difficulty. Addressing the main driver, agricultural overpumping, is politically very tricky.
Charging farmers for electricity, for instance.
Exactly. Makes economic sense for water management, perhaps, but politically very sensitive, huge pushback potential.
So what are governments focusing on instead?
The current focus tends to be more on supply-side solutions, like programs to enhance groundwater recharge, building check dams, things like that. Sujala, Jal Shakti Abhiyan are mentioned.
Which seems sensible, trying to put more water back in.
It is important, yes, but the study strongly emphasizes that recharge efforts alone won't solve the problem if the massive abstraction, the amount being taken out, isn't reduced. You can't fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom if the hole is huge.
Makes sense. And what about all those abandoned wells we talked about? Do they play a role?
They do, in a rather unhelpful way. The study calls it the groundwater recovery paradox.
Okay, what's the paradox?
Because there are so many old, abandoned, but still usable wells scattered everywhere, even when there's a good monsoon year and the water table could potentially recover a bit.
Farmers can just switch the pumps back on in those old wells.
Precisely. Any potential recovery gets quickly canceled out by resumed pumping. It prevents the aquifer from getting any real respite. It's a feedback loop, hindering recovery.
Wow. So the legacy of past drilling actually hampers future recovery.
Yeah.
And the researchers think this situation isn't unique to just these two villages.
They strongly suspect it's not. The conditions of the hard rock geology, the heavy reliance on groundwater, the agricultural drivers are very common across large parts of peninsular India. So this could be a ticking time bomb for drinking water security in many, many rural communities.
That's a sobering thought. So what needs to change fundamentally?
The study argues for a major shift in how water resources are planned and managed. You can't treat drinking water supply in isolation anymore.
It has to be integrated.
Yes, integrated with agricultural water demand, with industrial use,
Yeah.
all within the limits of what the environment can actually sustain. A holistic view is needed.
And they floated an idea involving farmers, potentially, an alternative to just cutting off water or power.
Yeah, acknowledging the political reality, they suggest exploring financial incentives, basically paying farmers potentially to shift towards crops or other income sources that use less water.
So supporting livelihoods while also reducing the pressure on groundwater, a carrot instead of just a stick.
Kind of, yeah. It's about finding pathways that work for both agriculture and long-term water security. It's complex, no easy answers.
No, definitely not. But this deep dive really drives home how everything is linked, doesn't it? The water in your glass, the crops in the field, the electricity policy, the local government's budget, it's all connected.
Absolutely. And the big takeaway for me is that just focusing on the supply side for drinking water, just drilling deeper wells, clearly isn't working. It's a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem when the source itself is vanishing due to these other huge demands.
Yeah, it really highlights the vulnerability of these communities. They're bearing the financial brunt of a problem largely driven by factors outside their direct control.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? If this is happening here, in these specific villages documented so well by the study, where else is this unfolding right now? Perhaps less visibly.
And that leaves a really crucial question for all of us, and especially for you listening. Could finding ways to financially support farmers in transitioning away from water-intensive agriculture be the key? How do we strike that balance between vital food production and the fundamental right to water, especially as resources get tighter?
A really critical question for the future. If you want to explore the nuts and bolts, the detailed data and methods, we absolutely recommend checking out the full article in PLOS Water. It's called Chasing the Water Table: The Impact of Groundwater Depletion on Rural Drinking Water Supply in Peninsular India. It's a really powerful piece of research.